The autumn wind carried the stench of betrayal across the Nebraska plains, where a woman's dreams lay shattered like glass in the dirt. What started as hope for a new life had become a nightmare of rejection, cruelty, and sleeping among swine. But sometimes, in the darkest moments, salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train's whistle shrieked across the endless prairie as it pulled into Millfield Station, black smoke billowing against the copper sky of October 1887. The platform buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals, cattlemen collecting supplies, farmers hauling grain sacks, children darting between the wheels of waiting wagons. But among all the familiar faces, one figure stood apart. Margaret Sullivan stepped down from the passenger car with trembling legs, her worn leather satchel clutched tight against her chest. At 24, she possessed a quiet beauty that had been weathered by hardship. Auburn hair pinned beneath a faded blue bonnet, green eyes that held both hope and wariness, and a dress of simple brown wool that had seen better days. Her hands, though calloused from years of factory work in Chicago, shook as she smoothed her skirts and searched the crowd. She was looking for Thomas Brennan, the man whose letters had promised her a new life as his wife. For 6 months, their correspondence had painted pictures of a prosperous ranch, a comfortable home, and most importantly, a kind husband who would cherish her after a lifetime of loneliness. The photograph he'd sent showed a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and a warm smile, standing proudly before a large farmhouse with white-painted shutters and a wraparound porch. Margaret had sold everything she owned to afford the train ticket from Illinois. Her meager savings from 12-hour days at the textile mill, the small inheritance from her deceased parents, even her mother's wedding ring, all sacrificed for this chance at happiness. She carried with her only one trunk of belongings and a heart full of carefully guarded hope. The platform began to empty as passengers found their destinations, but no gentleman approached to claim her. Margaret's eyes darted from face to face, clutching the photograph Thomas had sent. Her pulse quickened with each passing minute, anxiety gnawing at her stomach like hunger. Finally, she spotted him. But the man walking toward her bore little resemblance to the photograph's promise. Thomas Brennan was indeed tall and broad-shouldered, but his face was hard as granite, with cold grey eyes that looked her up and down like livestock at auction. His clothes were fine enough, pressed trousers, polished boots, a vest that spoke of prosperity, but there was something cruel in the set of his mouth, something dismissive in the way he circled her without speaking. "You, Margaret Sullivan?" His voice was sharp, businesslike, completely devoid of the warmth his letters had suggested. "Yes, sir. Mr. Brennan." She offered a nervous smile, trying to bridge the gap between expectation and reality. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you. Your letters were so—" "Letters." He cut her off with a bark of laughter that held no humor. "You look nothing like what I expected." Margaret's smile faltered. I sent you my photograph just as you requested. The same one That photograph must have been taken in mighty flattering light." Thomas walked another slow circle around her, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as other passengers began to stare. "You're smaller than I thought. Plainer. And those hands—" He grabbed her wrist roughly, examining her work-worn fingers. "Look like you've been digging ditches." "I worked in a factory, sir. Honest work to support myself after my parents passed." Margaret tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened. "I can cook and clean and manage a household. I know my letters mentioned—" "Your letters mentioned a lot of things." Thomas finally released her wrist, leaving red marks where his fingers had pressed. "They mentioned a woman of refinement, education, beauty." His eyes raked over her again, finding her lacking in every measure. "What I see is a used-up mill worker trying to pass herself off as quality." The words hit Margaret like physical blows. Around them, the remaining people on the platform had grown quiet, sensing the drama unfolding. A few women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes full of pity and embarrassment, not for Thomas's cruelty, but for Margaret's obvious rejection. "Please, Mr. Brennan." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper, desperation creeping in. "I traveled. So far, I have nowhere else to go. I sold everything I had to come here, just as we agreed. Your letters said, my letters were written to a different woman than the one standing before me." Thomas pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, her photograph, the one she'd saved money to have professionally taken at a studio in Chicago. He held it up beside her face, mockingly. This woman looked like she could bear strong sons and manage a prosperous household. This woman looked like she belonged on the arm of a successful rancher. He let the photograph flutter to the dirt at her feet. What I got instead was a scrawny factory girl with calloused hands and desperate eyes. His voice rose loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could fool me into accepting damaged goods?" Margaret bent to retrieve her photograph, but Thomas stepped on it deliberately, grinding it into the dust with his boot heel. The gesture was calculated, designed to break whatever dignity she had left. "I already paid your train fare here," he continued, his tone growing colder with each word. "That was generous enough. But I won't be saddled with a wife who misrepresented herself. A man of my standing has a reputation to maintain." "But the marriage arrangement," Margaret stammered, clutching her satchel tighter. "The contracts we signed through the agency are null and void when one party commits fraud." Thomas straightened his vest with satisfaction. "You presented yourself falsely, Miss Sullivan. That voids any agreement between us." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, though she stood perfectly still. "I don't understand. I told you the truth about everything, my age, my background, my circumstances. I sent you my real photograph. I never lied about anything." "The truth," Thomas laughed harshly. "The truth is, you're not the woman I was promised. The truth is, you're not fit to be seen with a man of my position. Look at yourself. That dress has been mended a dozen times, those shoes are worn through at the heels, and your hands look like you've been scrubbing floors your whole life. Each observation was accurate, and each one stung like salt in an open wound." Margaret had tried so hard to present her best self, spending her last decent coins on having her dress cleaned and pressed, polishing her shoes until they shone despite their age. But poverty was hard to hide, and harder still to wash away. "I may not have fine things," she said quietly, trying to salvage some shred of dignity, "but I'm honest and hard-working. I can learn whatever you need me to learn. I can be the wife you need. What I need," Thomas said with finality, "is a woman who won't embarrass me in front of my neighbors and business associates. What I need is someone who looks like she belongs, in a fine house, not a factory dormitory." He turned as if to walk away, then paused dramatically. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Patterson takes in unfortunate women. You might find lodging there, at least until you can arrange passage back to wherever you came from." "I don't have money for passage back." The admission escaped before Margaret could stop it, revealing the full extent of her vulnerability. "I told you. I spent everything I had to come here." Thomas shrugged with elaborate indifference. "That's not my concern. You made your choices, Miss Sullivan. Live with the consequences." He strode away toward a waiting carriage, his driver helping him up without so much as a backward glance. Margaret watched the fine black horses pull him away from the station, taking with them every hope she'd carried across 3 states and 2 territories. The platform had nearly emptied now, leaving Margaret standing alone with her trunk and satchel, surrounded by the debris of her shattered dreams. The autumn wind picked up, cutting through her wool dress and making her shiver. The photograph of her face, torn and muddied, blue, against her skirts before the wind carried it away entirely. She had no money, no return ticket, and no place to go. The boarding house Thomas had mentioned might take her in temporarily. But what then? How could she earn enough to survive in a strange town where everyone would soon know she'd been rejected as unfit for marriage? As the sun began to set over the Nebraska plains, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Margaret Sullivan realized that her journey west hadn't brought her to a new beginning at all. It had brought her to what might very well be the end of everything she'd ever hoped for. The train's whistle sounded again in the distance, carrying away her last connection to the life she'd left behind. Now she stood at the edge of an unknown world with nothing but her pride, and even that lay trampled in the dust at her feet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house squatted like a wounded animal at the end of Elm Street, its grey clapboard siding peeling and its shutters hanging at defeated angles. The sign out front, weather-beaten and barely legible, advertised clean rooms, Christian women only, references required. But as Margaret discovered when she knocked on the door with trembling fingers, Mrs. Patterson's definition of Christian charity came with a steep price and harsh conditions. The landlady herself was a woman carved from disappointment and vinegar. Tall, sharp-boned, with steel-grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval. She looked Margaret up and down with the same calculating coldness Thomas Brennan had shown at the station. "So you're the mail-order bride that got herself rejected," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd predicted disaster from the start. Word travels fast in a town this size. Thomas Brennan was smart to send you packing. Margaret's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to maintain composure. "Ma'am, I just need a place to stay while I figure out my next step. I can pay for a week in advance." She reached into her small purse, counting out the few precious coins she had left, barely enough for a few nights' lodging, let alone food. Mrs. Patterson snatched the money and examined each coin as if suspecting forgery. "This covers 3 nights in the cellar room, no meals included. You'll fetch your own water from the well out back, and you'll be out by sunrise if I catch you entertaining male visitors or causing trouble." The cellar room was exactly what it sounded like, a cramped space beneath the main house, accessible only through a narrow wooden door that led down a steep set of stairs. The ceiling was so low, Margaret had to duck her head, and the small window near the ceiling was grimy and barred. The furnishings consisted of a sagging cot with a straw mattress, a wooden crate that served as a table, and a chipped wash basin. The air smelled of mold and dampness, with an underlying odor of something unpleasant that Margaret couldn't quite identify. But it was shelter, and in her current circumstances, that made it precious beyond measure. On her first morning, Margaret ventured into town to look for work. Millfield was larger than she'd expected, with a main street lined with shops, a bank, a hotel, and several saloons that seemed to do brisk business even in the early hours. The railroad had brought prosperity to this part of Nebraska, and cattle, ranches stretching for miles in every direction, meant there was money flowing through the local economy. Unfortunately, none of that prosperity was available to a rejected mail-order bride with no local connections. Her first stop was Henderson's general store, where a bell jingled cheerfully as she entered. The shop was well stocked with everything from bolts of fabric to farm tools, and the proprietor, a round man with kind eyes, looked up from his ledger book as she approached. "Good morning, sir. I'm looking for work," Margaret began, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "I have experience with inventory, can handle money, and I'm good with numbers." Mr. Henderson's expression shifted from polite interest to uncomfortable recognition. "You're the young lady who came in on yesterday's train, the one Thomas Brennan He trailed off, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Yes, sir, but I'm an honest worker and I need employment." The shopkeeper fidgeted with his pencil, avoiding her eyes. "I'm sure you are, miss, but I've got to think about my business. Folks around." "Here, well, they talk. Having someone working here who's been publicly rejected, it might reflect poorly on the establishment. You understand." The pattern repeated itself throughout the morning. The millinery shop, the bakery, the hotel restaurant, everywhere she went, Margaret found that news of her humiliation had preceded her. Shopkeepers who might have welcomed an experienced worker instead turned her away with embarrassed excuses and sidelong glances. By afternoon, desperate and growing hungry, Margaret swallowed her pride and tried the saloons. Surely establishments that catered to cowboys and drifters would be less concerned with social respectability. But even there, she found only closed doors and crude comments from patrons who saw her desperation as entertainment. "Looking for work, sweetheart?" called out a grizzled man from a bar stool, his words slurred with whiskey. "I got some work for you upstairs, if you know what I mean." The laughter that followed his suggestion was like broken glass, cutting whatever remained of Margaret's dignity. She fled back to Mrs. Patterson's cellar room with empty hands and an emptier stomach. That evening, as she sat on her narrow cot, counting and recounting her dwindling coins, Margaret faced a truth she'd been trying to avoid. She had enough money for perhaps 2 more nights' lodging, but nothing for food. Her trunk contained a few changes of clothes, her mother's Bible, and some personal mementos, but nothing of value she could sell. The jewelry was already gone, sold to buy her train ticket. Sleep came fitfully on the lumpy straw mattress, and Margaret's dreams were filled with the sound of Thomas Brennan's cruel laughter and the whispered gossip of strangers. She woke before dawn, stomach cramping with hunger, to the sound of Mrs. Patterson's heavy footsteps on the floor above. The second day brought more of the same: closed doors, pitying looks, and the growing realization that her reputation as a rejected bride was spreading through Millfield like wildfire. Women crossed the street to avoid speaking to her, and men looked at her with a mixture of contempt and unwelcome interest. By the third day, Margaret was weak with hunger. She'd managed to stretch a single biscuit purchased from the bakery across 2 days, supplemented with water from Mrs. Patterson's well, but her body was beginning to fail. Her hands shook when she tried to write in the small diary she'd kept since leaving Chicago, and her vision occasionally blurred from lack of nourishment. It was on this third day that she encountered Sarah Mitchell, a woman about her own age, who worked as a seamstress above the general store. Sarah had been watching Margaret's increasingly desperate job search with what appeared to be sympathy, and finally approached her as Margaret sat on a bench outside the post office trying to gather strength for another round of rejections. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I heard about your situation. I'm sorry for what happened with Mr. Brennan." Margaret looked up, surprised by the genuine kindness in the woman's voice. "Thank you. That's more consideration than most have shown." Sarah sat beside her, smoothing her practical brown skirt. "I know what it's like to be alone in a hard world. My husband died in a mining accident 2 years ago, left me with nothing but debt and a baby to raise. I'm sorry for your loss. The thing is," Sarah continued, lowering her voice even further, "there might be work available, but it's not what a lady would typically consider." Margaret's heart leapt with hope. "I'll consider anything honest. I'm not above hard work." Sarah hesitated, wringing her hands. "There's a pig farm about 5 miles outside of town. Belongs to a man named Jeremiah Hutchins. He's eccentric, lives alone, keeps to himself, doesn't come to town much. Word is, he's looking for help with the animals and general farm work." "That sounds perfect," Margaret said eagerly. "Could you tell me how to find him?" "Here's the thing," Sarah said, her expression growing more troubled. "Jeremiah's reputation isn't good. People say he's difficult, mean-spirited. The last 2 people who worked for him left without their full wages, claiming he was impossible to work with." Margaret felt a familiar sinking sensation. "But he might hire me." "He might. He's probably desperate enough by now. The work is hard, feeding pigs, mucking out pens, cleaning the house, and the pay won't be much, but it would be something. Could you give me directions?" Sarah did, but her face remained clouded with concern. "Promise me you'll be careful. If things get bad out there, don't stay out of pride. Come back to town, even if you have to sleep under the stars." That afternoon, Margaret packed her few belongings and left Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The landlady watched her go with undisguised satisfaction, already counting the money she'd make from someone more respectable. The walk to Hutchins' pig farm took Margaret nearly 3 hours, her trunk growing heavier with each mile. The late autumn air was sharp and cold, cutting through her wool dress and making her grateful for the physical exertion that kept her blood moving. The landscape around Millfield was mostly flat prairie, but the pig farm sat in a slight depression where a small creek provided water for the animals. She smelled the farm long before she saw it. The odor hit her like a physical wall. The pungent, overwhelming stench of pig manure mixed with rotting feed and something else she couldn't identify but wished she couldn't smell. As she crested a small hill, the farm spread out below her in all its squalid reality. Dozens of pigs wallowed in muddy pens that surrounded a ramshackle house. The fencing was makeshift and patched in multiple places. The barn leaned at an alarming angle, and scattered around the property were piles of refuse and broken equipment. It was a portrait of neglect and isolation that made Mrs. Patterson's cellar room seem luxurious by comparison. But it was also the only place in 50 miles where Margaret Sullivan might find work. She straightened her shoulders, picked up her trunk, and walked down the hill toward whatever awaited her at the bottom. Jeremiah Hutchins emerged from his ramshackle house like a creature disturbed from hibernation. He was a man in his 50s, tall and gaunt, with stringy grey hair that hung past his shoulders and a beard stained yellow from tobacco. His clothes were filthy, a shirt that might have once been white, patched trousers held up with rope instead of a proper belt, and boots caked with mud, and worse things Margaret didn't want to identify. But it was his eyes that made her instinctively step backward. They were small, pale blue, and held the calculating meanness of someone who had learned to find pleasure in the suffering of those weaker than himself. "You the woman looking for work?" His voice was nasal and sharp, cutting through the evening. "Air like a rusty blade." "Yes, sir. Margaret Sullivan. I was told you might need help with farm work." Jeremiah circled her slowly, just as Thomas Brennan had done at the train station. But this appraisal was different. Where Thomas had looked at her with disappointment, Jeremiah's gaze held predatory satisfaction. He was seeing exactly what he'd hoped to find, a desperate woman with nowhere else to turn. "You're that mail-order bride that got herself rejected," he said with a cruel chuckle. "Thomas Brennan's got taste. I'll give him that. Won't take damaged goods." Margaret forced herself to remain calm. "I'm willing to work hard for fair wages, Mr. Hutchins. I need employment." "Fair wages," Jeremiah repeated mockingly. "Fair wages. You hear that, Gertrude?" He addressed this last comment to a massive sow wallowing in the nearest pen. "The rejected bride wants fair wages." The pig grunted as if in response, and Jeremiah slapped his knee with delight at his own wit. "Here's what's fair," he continued, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "You'll work from dawn to dusk. You'll feed the pigs, clean the pens, muck out the barn, tend my house, cook my meals, and wash my clothes. In return, you get a place to sleep and enough food to keep you working. No wages." "No wages?" Margaret's heart sank. "Sir, I need money to eventually leave here, to find—" "Leave," Jeremiah's pale eyes glittered with amusement. "Where exactly do you think you're going? You got any family expecting you? Any other job prospects? Any money for train fare?" The questions hit their mark precisely because Margaret had no answers for any of them. "Didn't think so," Jeremiah continued with satisfaction. "See, the way I figure it, you need this place more than this place needs you. There's always another desperate woman willing to work for bed and board, but there ain't always another place desperate enough to take in a woman with your reputation." He gestured toward a small structure that barely qualified as a building, more of a lean-to, attached to the pig barn, with walls made of scrap lumber and a roof of rusted tin. "That's your quarters. You'll share it with the feed bags and the tools. Hope you don't mind the smell." Margaret looked at the ramshackle shelter, her stomach turning. The pig odor was overwhelming here, and she could see gaps in the walls that would provide little protection from the Nebraska winter that was fast approaching. "The work starts at 4 in the morning, Jeremiah said, already turning away. "Miss, your first feeding and you're out, understand?" What choice did she have? Margaret nodded mutely and dragged her trunk toward the lean-to that would serve as her home. Meanwhile, back in Millfield, the good citizens were conducting their daily business with the comfortable knowledge that they had handled the rejected bride situation appropriately. At Henderson's general store, customers gossiped over their purchases about Margaret's fall from grace. "I heard she's working out at Hutchins' place now," said Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, the banker's wife, as she selected fabric for new curtains. "Sleeping with the pigs, from what I'm told." "Well, what did she expect?" replied Mrs. Dorothy Klein, the postmaster's wife, examining a bolt of blue calico. "Coming here under false pretenses, trying to trap a decent man like Thomas Brennan into marriage. She made her bed, as they say." Mr. Henderson nodded sagely while wrapping their purchases. "Can't say I'm surprised. Woman like that, misrepresenting herself, she was bound to end up in a bad situation. Good thing Thomas saw through her deception before it was too late." None of them mentioned that they had personally turned Margaret away when she'd begged for honest work. None of them reflected on how their collective rejection had forced her into Jeremiah Hutchins' exploitative arrangement. It was easier to frame her suffering as the natural consequence of her own moral failings than to examine their role in creating her desperate circumstances. At the Millfield Hotel, where the town's more prosperous citizens gathered for evening meals, the conversation followed similar patterns. Judge William Crawford, a portly man with an impressive mustache, held court at a corner table. "I've seen it before," he declared to his dinner companions. "These mail-order bride arrangements rarely work out well. Women think they can misrepresent themselves and trap unsuspecting men into marriage. When it fails, they expect the community to clean up their mess." "Quite right," agreed Dr. Franklin Pierce, cutting into his beef with surgical precision. Thomas Brennan showed admirable restraint in his handling of the matter. Another man might have created a public scene, but he conducted himself like a gentleman. "Still," ventured Reverend Samuel Hayes, the young preacher who had offered Margaret prayers instead of practical help, "perhaps we should consider our Christian duty to help those in distress." Judge Crawford's mustache bristled with indignation. "Our Christian duty is to support moral behavior and discourage deception. That woman made her choices. Charity should go to the deserving poor, not to those who create their own difficulties through dishonesty." The other men murmured their agreement, satisfied that they had reasoned away any obligation to help. It never occurred to them to investigate whether Margaret had actually deceived anyone, or whether Thomas Brennan's rejection might have been motivated by something other than righteous indignation. Sarah Mitchell, the seamstress who had directed Margaret to the pig farm, wrestled with her own conscience as she worked late into the evening by lamplight. She had seen the desperation in Margaret's eyes, had recognized the hollow look of someone facing starvation. Yet she had done nothing more than point the way to what everyone knew was an exploitative situation. As her needle moved through the fabric of a dress ordered by one of the town's wealthier women, Sarah tried to justify her inaction. What could she have done, really? She was barely supporting herself and her infant son. Taking in Margaret would have meant 2 more mouths to feed on seamstress wages that barely covered rent and necessities. But the justifications felt hollow, especially when she remembered the gratitude in Margaret's voice when offered even that small bit of human kindness. Sarah had watched Margaret walk out of town that afternoon, carrying her heavy trunk toward an uncertain fate, and had done nothing to stop her or offer alternatives. The truth was, it was easier to let Margaret become Jeremiah Hutchins' problem than to find real solutions that might require sacrifice or inconvenience. At the Brennan Ranch, Thomas himself was entertaining guests for dinner, regaling them with the story of his narrow escape from matrimonial disaster. His dining room was elegant, with fine china and crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier. His guests, fellow ranchers and their wives, listened with the satisfaction of people hearing about someone else's misfortune. "You should have seen her," Thomas said, carving the roast with theatrical precision. "Nothing like the photograph she sent. Clearly deceived me about her circumstances and appearance. A man can't be expected to honor agreements made under false pretenses." "Absolutely not," agreed rancher Michael O'Brien, raising his wine glass. "You were right to send her. Packing. Can't have desperate women thinking they can fool their way into respectable marriages." Mrs. Eleanor Brennan, Thomas's mother, nodded approvingly from the head of the table. "A woman's appearance and breeding are reflections of her moral character. This Sullivan woman clearly lacked the refinement necessary for our family." None of them acknowledged that Thomas's photograph had been equally deceptive, taken several years earlier when he was younger, and before disappointment had hardened his features into perpetual cruelty. None of them mentioned that his letters had painted a picture of kindness and compassion that bore no resemblance to the man who had publicly humiliated a vulnerable woman. The conversation moved on to other topics: cattle prices, railroad expansion, local politics, while Margaret Sullivan's name became just another piece of dinner party gossip, quickly forgotten in favor of more pressing concerns. Back at the pig farm, Margaret spent her first night listening to the sounds of animals shifting and grunting just yards from where she lay on a pile of feed sacks. The smell was overwhelming, seeping into her clothes, her hair, her very skin. The lean-to provided little protection from the cold, and she shivered despite wrapping herself in her mother's quilt, the one precious item she couldn't bear to leave behind. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see the lights of Millfield, in the distance, warm and welcoming to those who belonged there. But for her, those lights might as well have been stars, visible but impossibly distant, beautiful but unreachable. As she finally drifted into exhausted sleep, Margaret couldn't know that her situation was being discussed and dismissed throughout the town she could see but no longer belonged to. She couldn't know that dozens of people who might have helped her had chosen instead to look away, to justify their indifference, to blame her for circumstances largely beyond her control. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring another day of backbreaking labor for a man who saw her desperation as an opportunity to exploit. And the town that had witnessed her fall continued its daily routine, comfortable in the knowledge that they had done nothing wrong by doing nothing at all. 3 weeks at Jeremiah Hutchins' pig farm had transformed Margaret Sullivan from a woman, clinging to dignity, into something barely recognizable as human. Her once auburn hair hung limp and greasy, stained with mud and worse substances she tried not to think about. Her brown dress, the nicest thing she'd owned, was now torn in multiple places and permanently stained with pig filth. Her hands, already calloused from factory work, were now cut and infected from handling rusted farm equipment and wrestling with aggressive sows. But it was the hunger that was killing her slowly, day by day. Jeremiah's idea of enough food to keep you working consisted of table scraps, moldy bread, spoiled vegetables, and watery soup made from potato peels and whatever meat had gone too rancid for even him to stomach. Margaret had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, her cheekbones, now sharp angles in her face grown gaunt with malnutrition. The work was relentless and degrading. Each morning at 4, she dragged herself from the feed sacks that served as her bed to begin the endless cycle of feeding dozens of pigs, cleaning their pens with a broken shovel, hauling buckets of slop that splashed over her clothes and skin. The pigs themselves seemed to sense her weakness, often knocking her down in their eagerness to reach their food, trampling her with hooves that left bruises across her back and legs. Jeremiah watched her struggles with sadistic pleasure, inventing new tasks whenever she managed to complete the existing ones. The house needed cleaning, scrubbing floors with lye soap that burned her already damaged hands. His clothes needed washing, garments so foul she had to hold her breath while handling them. The barn roof needed patching, dangerous work on a rickety ladder while he shouted conflicting instructions from below. When she worked too slowly, he withheld meals. When she showed any sign of resistance, he threatened to throw her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. And always, he reminded her that no one else would take her, that she was lucky to have even this wretched existence. "You think you're too good for this work?" he had sneered just that morning when Margaret stumbled while carrying a heavy bucket of pig feed. "You think you deserve better than what I'm giving you?" Margaret had said nothing, just picked up the spilled feed with hands that shook from exhaustion and malnutrition. But inside, something was breaking beyond repair. The breaking point came on a grey November morning when the first hard frost turned the ground iron solid and made every step treacherous. Margaret was attempting to repair a section of pig fencing when the rusted wire snapped, slashing across her forearm and opening a gash that bled freely through her torn sleeve. "Mr. Hutchins," she called, pressing her hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. "I need to tend to this cut. It's bleeding, badly." Jeremiah looked up from where he was lounging on his porch, a bottle of whiskey already in his hand despite the early hour. "Bleeding, is it? Well, wrap a rag around it and get back to work. Them pigs need feeding more than you need nursing." "Sir, I think it needs proper attention. It's quite deep, and I think you need to remember who's in charge here." Jeremiah interrupted, his voice turning dangerous. "You'll work with that cut or you'll work with no food for the next 2 days. Your choice." Margaret stared at him, this man who cared less about her well-being than he did about his animals, and something inside her finally snapped. Not with anger. She was too exhausted for anger, but with a clarity that cut through her desperation. Like light through fog. She was going to die here if she stayed at this pig farm, working for a man who saw her as less than human, eating food that barely kept her alive, sleeping in conditions that would shame a prison. She was going to waste away until there was nothing left. And when that happened, Jeremiah would simply find another desperate woman to take her place, and the cycle would continue. But maybe, just maybe, there was still someone in Millfield with enough conscience to help her. Maybe if she could make them see what their collective indifference had created, someone would find the courage to act. That afternoon, while Jeremiah passed out drunk on his porch, Margaret made a decision that would either save her life or seal her fate. She cleaned herself as best she could with water from the pig trough, combed her fingers through her matted hair, and wrapped her bleeding arm in a strip torn from her petticoat. Then she began the long walk back to town. The 5 miles felt like 50 in her weakened condition. Her legs trembled with each step, and twice she had to stop and rest by the roadside, her vision graying at the edges. But desperation drove her forward, one painful step at a time, until the buildings of Millfield appeared through the afternoon haze. The town looked exactly as she remembered, prosperous, clean, civilized. Such a sharp contrast to the hellish existence she'd been trapped in, that it felt like entering a different world entirely. People on the streets stopped and stared as she passed, their faces showing shock and disgust at her appearance. Women pulled their children closer and whispered. Behind gloved hands, men shook their heads and muttered about the degradation of moral standards, but Margaret was beyond caring about their disapproval. She had come here with a single purpose, and she would see it through no matter the cost to her remaining pride. Her stop was the church, where Reverend Hayes was preparing for evening services. The young preacher looked up from his Bible as Margaret entered, and his face went pale at the sight of her. "Dear God," he whispered, rising from the pulpit. "Miss Sullivan, what has happened to you?" "Please," Margaret said, her voice hoarse. "From weeks of breathing pig dust and hay particles, I need help. The work at Hutchins' farm, it's killing me. I'm starving, Reverend. I'm dying by inches, and I have nowhere else to turn." Reverend Hayes approached her carefully, as if afraid she might collapse. "You're injured," he said, noticing the blood-stained bandage around her arm. "Today's injury, yes, but there are others." Margaret pushed back her sleeves, revealing bruises in various stages of healing, cuts from rusty wire, infection around her fingernails from handling filthy equipment without proper tools. "He works me from dawn until I can barely stand, feeds me scraps that wouldn't satisfy a dog, and threatens to throw me out if I complain." The Reverend's eyes widened with horror. This is unconscionable. A Christian community cannot allow such treatment of anyone, regardless of their circumstances. Hope flared in Margaret's chest, the first hope she'd felt in weeks. "Then you'll help me? You'll speak to the congregation about finding me other work, or at least ensuring I receive fair treatment?" Reverend Hayes hesitated, his gaze darting toward the windows as if checking to see who might be watching. "Miss Sullivan, you must understand my position. I serve this entire community, and many of them feel that your situation is largely of your own making." "My own making?" Margaret's voice cracked. "How is being rejected by a cruel man my own making? How is being unable to find honest work because of gossip and prejudice my own making?" "The congregation believes you misrepresented yourself to Mr. Brennan," the Reverend said uncomfortably. "They feel that had you been honest from the beginning, this unfortunate situation could have been avoided." Margaret felt the hope draining out of her like blood from a wound. "So you won't help me?" "I'll pray for you," Reverend Hayes offered weakly. "I'll ask God to guide you toward a better path." "Prayers won't stop me from starving," Margaret said bitterly. "Prayers won't heal infected wounds or protect me from a man who sees me as livestock." She left the church without another word, ignoring the Reverend's stammered calls for her to wait. Outside, the autumn air felt colder than before, cutting through her inadequate clothing and chilling her to the bone. Her next stop was Dr. Franklin Pierce's office, where she hoped medical ethics might compel him to treat her injuries regardless of her ability to pay or her social standing. The doctor's waiting room was empty, and his receptionist, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, looked up with barely concealed revulsion as Margaret entered. "We don't treat charity cases," the woman said before Margaret could speak. "If you can't pay, you'll have to seek treatment elsewhere. Please, I just need someone to look at this cut. It's becoming infected, and I said we don't treat charity cases." The receptionist's voice was final. "Good day, Miss Sullivan." The use of her name confirmed what Margaret already knew. Her reputation had preceded her here as well. She was known throughout Millfield, not as a person in need of help, but as a problem to be avoided. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret made her desperate rounds through the town that had already rejected her once. She went to the women's auxiliary, where Mrs. Adelaide Morrison listened to her plea with visible impatience before explaining that their charity was reserved for deserving cases, widows and orphans, not women who had brought their troubles upon themselves. She tried the Union Hall, where working men might understand the exploitation of labor, but was turned away at the door by a burly man who told her that fallen women weren't welcome in a place of honest workers. She even swallowed her pride enough to approach Judge Crawford's house, hoping that an appeal to legal justice might move him to act. But the judge's housekeeper wouldn't even let her onto the property, threatening to call the sheriff if she didn't move along. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Margaret found herself standing in the town square, surrounded by the comfortable homes and prosperous businesses of people who had watched her fall and chosen to look away. Her legs could barely support her weight anymore, and the bleeding from her arm had started again, seeping through the makeshift bandage. She had made her plea to the leaders of the community, religious, medical, civic, and social. She had laid bare her desperation, her suffering, her very humanity, and every single one of them had found reasons to turn her away, to justify their indifference, to blame her for circumstances that had spiraled far beyond her control. Standing there in the gathering dusk, Margaret Sullivan raised her voice one last time in a desperate cry that carried across the square and echoed off the buildings where good Christian people were preparing their evening meals. "Please," she called out, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "Someone help me. I'm dying out there and I don't want to die. Please, someone have mercy." Windows opened briefly, faces appeared and disappeared, but no doors opened. To offer sanctuary. Her plea hung in the cold air for a moment, then was swallowed by the indifferent silence of a town that had already made its decision about Margaret Sullivan's worth. She began the long, painful walk back to the pig farm, knowing that Jeremiah would be furious about her absence and would likely withhold food for the next several days as punishment. But she also knew she had no choice but to return. It was the only shelter available to her, no matter how degrading or dangerous. As Millfield's lights began to twinkle behind her, Margaret wondered if this was how she would die, slowly, forgotten, among the pigs and filth of Jeremiah Hutchins' farm, while a town full of good people slept peacefully in their warm beds, secure in the knowledge that they bore no responsibility for her fate. The man who would change Margaret Sullivan's fate was sitting alone in Murphy's saloon when her desperate cry echoed across Millfield's town square. While the respectable citizens of the community closed their windows and turned away from her plea, Jack Cooper raised his head from his whiskey glass and listened with the attention of someone who understood what it meant to be cast aside by society. At 35, Jack was a study in contradictions. His frame was powerful from years of cattle drives and ranch work, broad shoulders, calloused hands that could rope a steer or gentle a spooked horse with equal skill. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with deep lines around grey eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a memento from a knife fight in Dodge City that had nearly cost him his life. What made Jack an unlikely hero wasn't his appearance. Plenty of men in Nebraska looked like they could handle trouble. It was his reputation that set him apart in ways that should have disqualified him from any rescue mission. Jack Cooper was what the townspeople politely called a drifter, and less politely called trouble. He'd ridden into Millfield 6 months earlier with nothing but his horse, his saddle, and a Colt .45 that he wore with the easy familiarity of a man who'd had cause to use it. He worked as a hired gun for cattle ranchers, dealing with rustlers, took odd jobs that required more muscle than morality, and kept company with gamblers, prostitutes, and other members of society's fringe. The good people of Millfield tolerated Jack's presence because he was useful when problems arose that couldn't be solved through proper channels. When the Morrison Ranch was being terrorized by claim jumpers, it was Jack who'd settled the matter with brutal efficiency. When thieves were hitting the area, Jack tracked them down and returned the stolen animals, along with ears cut from the rustlers as proof of his methods. He was the kind of man respectable society needed but refused to acknowledge, useful in the shadows but unwelcome in the light. Most damning of all, Jack had a weakness for lost causes and broken people. He'd been known to take the side of underdogs, against their betters, to defend Mexican ranch hands against abusive foremen, to help runaway wives escape violent husbands. These interventions had earned him a reputation as someone who didn't respect the natural order of things, who thought he could play God with other people's arrangements. Which was exactly why the sound of Margaret Sullivan's desperate plea cut through his whiskey-dulled consciousness like a blade. Jack had been in Murphy's saloon since late afternoon, working his way through a bottle of rot-gut whiskey and trying to forget the job he'd completed the week before. A rancher named Cornelius Blake had hired him to persuade a family of homesteaders to abandon their claim to a water source Blake wanted for his cattle. The homesteaders, a young couple with 2 small children, had refused to sell their land. For Blake's insulting offer, Jack had done what Blake paid him to do. He'd burned their crops, scattered their livestock, and made it clear that worse would follow if they didn't leave. The family had packed up and moved on, their dreams of owning, and destroyed by a man with more money and fewer scruples. It was legal work, technically. Blake had a legitimate claim to the water rights, and the homesteaders were probably destined to fail anyway. Most of them did. But watching those children's faces as their home went up in smoke had left Jack with a familiar taste of ashes in his mouth, the flavor of a man who'd chosen survival over conscience one too many times. Now, hearing Margaret's broken voice calling for mercy that wouldn't come, Jack felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead. Maybe it was the whiskey loosening his usual careful control, or maybe it was simple recognition, the sound of someone fighting against drowning in a world that didn't care if they lived or died. He drained his glass, left coins on the scarred wooden table, and walked out into the gathering darkness. The town square was empty now, Margaret's voice having faded into the distance as she began her long walk back to whatever hell she'd escaped from temporarily. But Jack's trained eyes picked up the signs of her passage, drops of blood on the wooden sidewalk, the impression of small feet in the dirt, the lingering scent of pig filth and human desperation. He followed the trail at an easy pace, his horse's hooves making soft sounds on the packed earth. Jack had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to understand a situation was to observe it from a distance before acting. Too many men rushed in without understanding what they were getting themselves into, and too many of those men ended up dead or worse. The pig farm was exactly what he'd expected based on the stories he'd heard around town. Jeremiah Hutchins had a reputation even among men who weren't squeamish about unpleasant work. The place reeked of neglect and cruelty, and Jack's experienced eye took in the signs of a man who'd given up any pretense of decent treatment for his animals, let alone his workers. He dismounted about a quarter-mile from the main buildings and moved forward on foot, using the darkness and his knowledge of how to approach dangerous situations without being detected. What he saw when he reached a position where he could observe the farmyard made his jaw clench with a fury he hadn't felt since watching those homesteader children cry. Margaret Sullivan was on her hands and knees in the pig pen, trying to gather scattered feed, while a massive boar snorted and threatened to charge her. Her movements were slow and unsteady, those of someone operating on the very edge of physical collapse. Even in the moonlight, Jack could see that she was dangerously thin, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. Jeremiah Hutchins stood on the porch of his ramshackle house, a bottle in one hand and a whip in the other, shouting slurred instructions and obscene criticism. Move faster, you worthless bitch. Them pigs eat better than you deserve. Should have thought about that before you tried to run off to town with your sob story. The whip cracked, not hitting Margaret, but coming close enough to make her flinch and nearly fall face first into the mud. She straightened slowly, her breathing visible in the cold air, and continued her work without complaint. Jack had seen enough. He'd witnessed plenty of cruelty in his 35 years. Hell, he'd participated in more than his share of it. But there was something about watching a woman work herself to death for a man who took pleasure in her suffering that crossed a line Jack hadn't even known he still possessed. The smart play would be to ride away. Margaret Sullivan's problems weren't his concern, and getting involved would likely bring him more trouble than he needed. Jeremiah Hutchins was connected to some of the area's less savory businesses, and crossing him might mean losing future work opportunities. Besides, what could one broken-down gunslinger really do to change the fundamental unfairness of a world that ground up people like Margaret and discarded them without a second thought? But as Jack watched Margaret stumble and nearly fall again, as he heard Jeremiah's drunken laughter echo across the farmyard, he realized that some lines couldn't be uncrossed once you'd seen them violated. He'd spent most of his adult life taking money to solve other people's problems through violence and intimidation. He'd never been the hero in anyone's story. Usually he was the obstacle heroes had to overcome. But looking at Margaret Sullivan's broken form in that pig pen, Jack Cooper felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. Maybe it was time to see what it felt like to be on the other side of one of these stories. He returned to his horse and rode openly up the farm's main path, making no attempt at stealth. His spurs rang against the stirrups, and his horse's hooves drummed a steady rhythm that announced his approach. By the time he reached the farmyard, both Jeremiah and Margaret had stopped what they were doing to stare at this unexpected visitor. Jack dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was dressed in black wool pants, a white shirt that had seen better days, and a leather vest that bore the scars of hard use. His gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster positioned for a quick draw, and the weapon itself was clean and well-maintained despite the worn condition of everything else he owned. "Evening, Hutchins," Jack said, his voice carrying clearly across the farmyard. "Nice night for a conversation." Jeremiah squinted through his drunken haze, trying to place this visitor. "Jack Cooper? What the hell you want here? This is private property. "Just wanted to see how you treat your workers," Jack replied, his grey eyes taking in every detail of Margaret's condition. "Word in town is you've got yourself quite the arrangement here. Ain't none of your damn business how I run my operation." Jeremiah's voice carried the belligerence of a drunk who felt his authority being questioned. "That woman works for me fair and square." Jack's gaze shifted to Margaret, who had stopped trying to gather pig feed and was watching this exchange, with the wary hope of someone who'd learned not to expect rescue, but couldn't quite stop hoping for it. "Ma'am," Jack said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that Margaret hadn't received from anyone in months. "You look like you could use some help." The simple courtesy, being addressed as ma'am instead of girl or bitch, being spoken to as a human being deserving of basic respect, nearly brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "She don't need no help from you," Jeremiah snarled, stepping down from his porch with the unsteady aggression of a man who'd had too much whiskey and not enough sense. "She's got work to do, and you're interfering with it." Jack's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle adjustment that men familiar with violence would recognize as preparation for action. "Seems to me," Jack said conversationally, "that there's different kinds of work and different ways of treating people who do that work. What I'm seeing here doesn't look much like either." The confrontation that would change 3 lives forever was about to begin. The tension in the farmyard stretched taut as piano wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Jeremiah Hutchins clutched his whiskey bottle in one hand and his whip in the other, swaying slightly as the alcohol warred with his instinct for self-preservation. He'd dealt with troublemakers before, but Jack Cooper wasn't just any troublemaker. He was a man whose reputation for violence preceded him like smoke before fire. "I'm telling you to get off my property," Jeremiah slurred, trying to inject authority into his voice. "That woman signed a work agreement. She stays until I say she goes." Jack's eyes never left Jeremiah's face, but he was aware of everything. Margaret's labored breathing, the aggressive boar still snorting in the pen, the rusty farm tools that could become weapons, the distance to cover if Jeremiah decided to use that whip for something other than intimidation. What kind of work agreement involves a woman sleeping with pigs? Jack asked, his tone conversational, but carrying an edge that made Jeremiah take an involuntary step backward. "The kind that keeps worthless trash from starving on the streets," Jeremiah shot back, his fear making him more aggressive. "She came here begging for work after that mail-order bride scheme of hers fell through. I gave her what she asked for. Did you now?" Jack's gaze flicked briefly to Margaret, taking in her hollow cheeks, the way her clothes hung on her emaciated frame, the fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage on her arm. "Looks to me like you gave her a slow death sentence." Margaret remained frozen in the pig pen, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile protection Jack's presence provided. She'd seen men like him before, dangerous men who lived by their own rules, but she'd never had one speak on her behalf. The novelty of having someone acknowledge her humanity was almost overwhelming. "She gets food and shelter," Jeremiah protested, gesturing toward the lean-to that served as Margaret's quarters. "More than she deserves, considering her reputation." "Her reputation?" Jack's voice dropped to a deadly quiet that made even the pigs seem to sense the danger in the air. "You mean the reputation she got from being rejected by a man who judged her by her appearance rather than her character?" "Thomas Brennan's a respectable member of this community," Jeremiah bristled. "He had every right to refuse damaged goods." The phrase damaged goods hit Jack like a physical blow, triggering memories he'd spent years trying to bury. He remembered his own sister, Sarah, who'd been called worse names by better people after she'd borne a child out of wedlock. He remembered how the good Christians of their hometown had driven her away, forcing her into the kind of desperate circumstances that led to desperate choices. He remembered finding her body in a San Francisco alley, dead from a combination of laudanum and despair, clutching a letter she'd never had the courage to send home. "Damaged goods," Jack repeated, his hand drifting almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. "That what you call a woman who's done nothing but try to survive in a world that seems determined to destroy her?" Jeremiah must have sensed the shift in Jack's demeanor because his grip tightened on the whip handle. "Look, Cooper, I don't know what your interest is in this woman, but she ain't worth dying for. She's nothing but a worn-out factory girl who thought she could fool her way into respectability." "Maybe," Jack said, taking a step forward. "But even worn-out factory girls deserve better than being worked to death by drunken pig farmers who get their kicks from watching women suffer." "I provide honest work for honest wages," Jeremiah protested, though the lie sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Honest wages?" Jack's laugh was devoid of humor. "What wages would those be, Hutchins? Because from where I'm standing it looks like you've got yourself a slave, not an employee." Margaret found her voice at last, though it came out as barely, more than a whisper. "He doesn't pay me anything. Says room and board is payment enough, but the room is that lean-to with the pigs, and the board is scraps that wouldn't feed a dog." Jack's expression grew even more dangerous. "That true, Hutchins? You working this woman for nothing but rotten food and a place to sleep in pig filth?" "She agreed to the terms," Jeremiah said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Nobody forced her to stay." "Nobody forced her to stay," Jack repeated mockingly, "except she's got no money, no other place to go. and you've made sure she's too weak to leave even if she wanted to. That sound like a free choice to you?" The confrontation was escalating beyond Jeremiah's ability to control through bluster and intimidation. He was dealing with a man who wouldn't be cowed by threats or bought off with promises of future considerations. Jack Cooper was the kind of man who settled disputes with bullets, and Jeremiah was suddenly soberly aware that he might have pushed too far. "Look, Cooper," Jeremiah said, trying a different approach. "Maybe we can work something out. You want the woman? Take her. I'll find someone else." "Take her?" Jack's voice carried such menace that Margaret actually saw Jeremiah flinch. "You think she's property to be traded like a horse or a sack of grain?" "I just meant—" "I know what you meant." Jack took another step forward, and Jeremiah retreated toward his porch. "You meant she's an object for men to use and discard as they see fit. First, Thomas Brennan treats her like damaged merchandise. Then you treat her like livestock. And now you want to hand her over to me like she's a poker debt. You're settling." Margaret watched this exchange with growing amazement. In all her months of suffering, from Thomas's public rejection to the townspeople's indifference to Jeremiah's cruelty, no one had ever articulated the fundamental injustice of how she'd been treated. No one had ever suggested that she deserved to be treated as a human being with rights and dignity. "What do you want from me?" Jeremiah demanded, his bravado crumbling under Jack's relentless advance. "I want you to understand something," Jack said, stopping just outside the reach of Jeremiah's whip. "That woman has been through enough hell to last several lifetimes. She came here looking for work, and you turned her into a slave. She came to your neighbors for help, and they turned their backs on her. She's been beaten down by every person who should have helped her." Jack's hand now rested openly on his gun butt, a gesture that wasn't lost on Jeremiah. "But I'm not every person," Jack continued, "and I've got a different way of solving problems." Jeremiah's eyes darted between Jack's face and his gun, calculating odds that weren't in his favor. Jack Cooper's reputation wasn't built on empty threats or lucky shots. Men who crossed him had a tendency to disappear or turn up dead in ways that couldn't quite be proven to be murder, but sure as hell weren't accidents. "You threatening me, Cooper?" "I'm explaining the situation to you," Jack replied calmly. "See, there's two ways this can go, the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you pay this woman what you owe her for 3 weeks of work. Fair wages, not pig scraps, and you let her walk away from here with her dignity intact. And the hard way?" Jack's smile was colder than the November wind. "The hard way is I demonstrate why men like Thomas Brennan hire men like me to solve their problems." The threat hung in the air between them, as clear as if Jack had drawn his gun and pointed it at Jeremiah's head. Both men understood the rules of this game. Violence was currency in their world, and Jack had considerably more of it to spend than a drunken pig farmer. But Jeremiah, despite his fear, wasn't ready to surrender completely. His pride and his prejudices warred with his survival instincts, and pride was winning. "She ain't worth what you're asking," he said, trying to sound defiant. "Look at her, half dead from her own weaknesses, probably diseased from living rough. You want to champion her cause? You're welcome to her, but I ain't paying good money for bad work. That was the wrong thing to say." Jack's gun cleared leather so fast that Margaret barely saw the movement. One moment his hand was resting on the butt, the next moment the barrel was pointed directly at Jeremiah's chest, the hammer cocked and ready. "You just called her diseased," Jack said, his voice deadly quiet. "You just said she's not worth fair. Payment for 3 weeks of backbreaking labor. You want to reconsider those statements?" Jeremiah's face went white as he stared down the barrel of Jack's Colt. The whiskey bottle slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the porch steps, and filling the air with the smell of cheap alcohol. "Easy, Cooper," Jeremiah stammered. "No need for that. We can discuss this like civilized men." "Civilized men," Jack repeated, his gun never wavering. "Civilized men don't work women to death for pig scraps. Civilized men don't take pleasure in watching the desperate suffer. You want to talk about civilization, Hutchins? Let's start with treating that woman like a human being instead of livestock. Margaret had never seen anything like it. A man willing to draw a gun to defend her honor, her dignity, her very humanity. After months of being treated as less than human, watching Jack face down Jeremiah with deadly intent felt like witnessing a miracle. "How much?" Jeremiah asked, his voice shaking. "How much do you want me to pay her?" "Fair wages for farm work," Jack replied. 3 weeks at $2 a day, that's $42, plus compensation for injuries sustained while working for you. Let's call it an even 50. $50? Jeremiah's voice cracked. "I don't have $50. "Then you better find it," Jack said, his gun still trained on Jeremiah's chest. "Because the alternative is, I put a bullet in you right here, right now, and take what she's owed from your corpse." The standoff stretched taut, both men knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended in payment or bloodshed. Margaret held her breath, hardly daring to believe that someone was finally fighting for her, finally demanding she be treated with basic human decency. The confrontation had reached its breaking point, and only one man would walk away victorious. Time seemed suspended in that moment, with Jack's gun trained steady on Jeremiah's chest and the pig farmer's life hanging by a thread thin as spider silk. The November wind whistled through the broken fencing, carrying the smell of hay and manure, while Margaret watched from the pig pen, scarcely daring to breathe for fear of breaking whatever spell had brought this moment of reckoning. Jeremiah's eyes darted frantically, calculating his options and finding them all wanting. Jack Cooper wasn't bluffing. The man's reputation was built on following through on threats, and the steady barrel of his Colt .45 never wavered despite the minutes that had passed. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a countdown to either payment or death. All right, Jeremiah finally gasped, his hands raised in surrender. "Don't shoot. I'll get your money." "Smart choice," Jack said, though his gun remained pointed at Jeremiah's heart. "Move slow. Keep your hands where I can see them, and remember that I've shot men for less than what you've done to that woman." Jeremiah stumbled toward his house, his legs unsteady from whiskey and terror. Jack followed at a safe distance, maintaining his aim while staying alert for any treachery. Through the broken windows and patched walls of the ramshackle building, Margaret could see shadows moving as Jeremiah frantically searched for the money that would buy his life. "You're making a mistake, Cooper," Jeremiah called out, his voice muffled by the walls but carrying clearly in the cold air. "She ain't worth this trouble. Soon as you turn your back, she'll run off and leave you holding nothing but regrets." "That's her choice to make," Jack replied calmly. "Something you never gave her." The searching sounds grew more frantic. Drawers being yanked open, furniture being shoved around, the desperate clatter of a man who suddenly realized his cruelty might cost him everything. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally Jeremiah emerged from the house clutching a leather pouch. "Here," he said, throwing the pouch at Jack's feet. "Every cent I got. Count it yourself." Jack glanced down at the pouch but didn't lower his weapon. "You count it, out loud, and if you're even $1 short, we're going to have problems." Jeremiah's hands shook as he opened the pouch and began counting coins and crumpled bills. 10, 15, 23, 31, 38, 44. "Keep counting," Jack said when Jeremiah hesitated. "That's all I got," Jeremiah protested. $44. I'm 6 short, but then you better find $6 more," Jack interrupted, "because we agreed on 50, and I always collect what's owed." Jeremiah's face went even paler. "I don't have $6 more. This is everything, I swear on my mother's grave." Jack studied him for a long moment, reading the truth in the man's terror. Jeremiah might be a lying, cruel bastard, but he wasn't lying about being broke. The pig farm was clearly failing, and whatever money he'd scraped together was probably his life savings. That watch, Jack said, nodding toward the tarnished silver timepiece hanging from Jeremiah's vest. That'll cover the difference. This was my father's watch, Jeremiah said, instinctively clutching the chain. Your father probably didn't use it to time how long he could work a woman without letting her eat, Jack replied coldly. Hand it over. Jeremiah reluctantly unclasped the watch and dropped it into the pouch with the money. Jack finally lowered his gun, though he kept it ready in case Jeremiah tried anything stupid. Ma'am, Jack called to Margaret, who was still standing in the pig pen, watching this surreal scene unfold. Come here. This money belongs to you. Margaret climbed slowly out of the pig pen, her movements stiff and painful from weeks of abuse. She approached Jack cautiously, still not quite believing that this was really happening, that someone had actually forced Jeremiah to pay her for her work. Jack handed her the leather pouch, and Margaret's fingers closed around it with reverence. It was the first money she'd held in months, the first tangible proof that her labor had value, that she was worth more than pig scraps and a pile of feed sacks. $44 and a watch, Jack said. Should be enough to get you somewhere. Better than this. Margaret opened the pouch and stared at the contents. More money than she'd expected to see again in her lifetime. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Jack said. You still got to decide what you want to do next. That money will buy you a train ticket back east, if that's what you want, or a room in town while you look. For honest work, your choice. The word choice hit Margaret like a revelation. For months, she'd been carried along by circumstances beyond her control, rejected by Thomas, exploited by Jeremiah, ignored by the townspeople. The idea that she could actually choose her own path seemed almost impossible to grasp. I don't have anywhere to go back east, she said slowly. No family, no connections, and I don't think the people of Millfield will suddenly change their minds about giving me work. Jack nodded, understanding her dilemma. There's other towns, other places where folks don't know your story and might judge you by your actions instead of your reputation. Margaret looked around the pig farm, at the squalid lean-to where she'd slept, at the muddy pens where she'd worked herself nearly to death, at Jeremiah who stood sulking by his porch. Then she looked at Jack, this dangerous man who'd risked his life to defend her dignity. What about you? She asked quietly. What will you do now? The question caught Jack off guard. He'd been so focused on rescuing Margaret from her immediate crisis that he hadn't thought much about what came next. His life was a series of temporary jobs and brief encounters, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or form lasting connections. I've got business in Colorado, he said eventually. Cattle drive starting up near Denver could use experienced hands. Could they use a cook? Margaret asked, surprising both of them with her boldness. I may not look like much now, but I can cook for large groups. Learnt it working in boarding houses before I came west. Jack studied her face, seeing something he hadn't expected, not just desperation or gratitude, but determination. Despite everything she'd endured, Margaret Sullivan hadn't been broken. Beaten down, yes. Weakened and scarred, certainly, but not broken. Trail cooking's hard work, Jack said carefully. Long hours, rough conditions, men who haven't seen a woman in months and might not behave like gentlemen. Harder than sleeping with pigs and working for scraps. Margaret asked with a ghost of a smile. I think I can manage. Jack found himself considering the possibility. Trail cooks were always in demand, especially ones who could handle the challenges of feeding 30 or 40 cowboys for months at a time. And having witnessed Margaret's endurance under the worst possible conditions, he had no doubt she could handle whatever a cattle drive might throw at her. The pay's decent, he said slowly. $30 a month plus food and gear. Money gets held by the trail boss until the drive's finished, so you can't lose it to gambling or thieves. $30 a month, Margaret repeated wonderingly. "That's more than I ever made at the textile mill." "It's honest money for honest." "Work," Jack confirmed. "And the men on a cattle drive, they respect good cooking. You'd be treated like what you are, a valuable member of the crew." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had brought her west as a mail-order bride, but genuine optimism based on her own abilities and the promise of fair treatment. "When does the drive start?" she asked. 3 weeks. Time enough for you to get yourself healthy again, buy proper gear, maybe learn a few things about trail cooking if you need to. Margaret looked down at the money in her hands, then back at Jack's weathered face. "You don't even know me. How do you know I won't disappoint you like I disappointed Mr. Brennan?" "Because," Jack said, holstering his gun at last, "I've seen what you're made of. You survived 3 weeks of this hell without breaking, without giving up, without losing your dignity, even when everyone around you tried to take it away. Any woman who can do that can handle whatever the trail throws at her." The simple declaration of faith in her abilities brought tears to Margaret's eyes. After months of being told she was worthless, damaged, unfit for decent society, having someone express confidence in her felt like a miracle. "There's one condition," Jack added, his expression growing serious. "You come with me. You're under my protection. That means if any man on the drive bothers you, disrespects you, or treats you as anything less than a lady, he answers to me." "Understand?" Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he was offering. Not charity, not pity, but partnership. Protection in exchange for skills, respect in exchange for honest work. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't express. Gratitude for her rescue, for being seen as human, for being offered a chance at a real future. Jack touched the brim of his hat in that same gesture of respect he'd shown when he first addressed her. "We'll leave for Denver tomorrow morning. You'll want to get yourself cleaned up, buy some proper clothes, maybe see a doctor about that." He turned to Jeremiah, who had been listening to this exchange with growing anger and resentment. "As for you," Jack said, his voice carrying unmistakable threat, "if I hear that you've mistreated another worker the way you treated her, I'll be back. And next time, I won't be interested in talking." Jeremiah nodded mutely, still pale from his brush with death. He'd learned the hard way that there were some lines even cruel men shouldn't cross, and that justice sometimes came from unexpected directions. As Jack and Margaret walked away from the pig farm together, leaving Jeremiah to contemplate his narrow escape, Margaret felt as though she was stepping out of one life and into another entirely. The road to Denver stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and possibilities, but for the first time since stepping off that train in Millfield months ago, Margaret Sullivan felt like she had a future worth fighting for. 3 weeks. Later, Margaret Sullivan stood at the edge of the sprawling cattle camp outside Denver, Colorado, watching the organized chaos of a trail drive preparing to move 2,000 head of longhorn cattle across 500 miles of dangerous territory. The woman who gazed out at this scene bore little resemblance to the broken figure who had collapsed in Jeremiah Hutchins's pig pen. Her auburn hair, now clean and properly pinned, caught the early morning sunlight. Her new clothes, sturdy canvas, pants, a practical cotton shirt, and boots designed for hard work rather than fashion, fit her restored figure comfortably. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out from 3 weeks of regular meals, and the infected wounds on her hands and arms had healed under proper medical care. Most importantly, her green eyes held a confidence that had been absent since the day Thomas Brennan rejected her at the train station. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first few days after leaving the pig farm, Margaret had struggled with nightmares, sudden fears, and the psychological wounds that couldn't be healed as easily as physical injuries. She jumped at unexpected sounds, flinched when men approached too quickly, and fought waves of panic whenever she thought about trusting anyone with her future again. Jack had been patient during her recovery, finding her a clean room at a respectable boarding house in Denver, ensuring she saw a doctor for her injuries, and giving her space to heal without pressure. He checked on her daily, sometimes bringing food when he noticed she wasn't eating enough, other times just sitting quietly while she worked through her fears and doubts. "You don't have to do this," he'd told her the night before the cattle drive was set to begin. "You've got money now and you're healthy again. There are other paths forward that don't involve months on the trail with 30 cowboys." But Margaret had made up her mind. The cattle drive represented something she'd never had before, the chance to earn her place through her own skills rather than her appearance, her connections, or her willingness to accept charity. It was an opportunity to prove to herself, as much as anyone else, that Margaret Sullivan was worth more than the sum of other people's rejections. Now, as she surveyed the camp that would be her world for the next 4 months, Margaret felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that was entirely different from the desperate hope she'd carried as a mail-order bride. This time, her future depended on her own abilities, not on the whims of a man who might find her lacking. The chuck wagon that would serve as her mobile kitchen was a marvel of practical engineering, built on a heavy wagon frame with iron-reinforced wheels designed to handle rough terrain. It contained everything needed to feed a small army: flour barrels, coffee supplies, dried beans, salt pork, cooking utensils, Dutch ovens, and a fold-down table that served as both workspace and serving counter. A water barrel hung from one side, while the other carried extra firewood and kindling. Trail boss Samuel Bull Henderson was a grizzled veteran of a dozen cattle drives, with silver hair, intelligent brown eyes, and the kind of calm authority that came from making life-and-death decisions in dangerous situations. He'd been initially skeptical when Jack brought Margaret to meet him, but her obvious competence and determination had won him over. "Miss Sullivan," Bull had said during their first meeting, "I won't lie to you about what this job entails. You'll be up before dawn every morning, preparing coffee and breakfast for 30 men who'll be hungry, tired, and sometimes ornery. You'll travel 15 to 20 miles a day in that wagon, cooking meals over open fires in all weather conditions. You'll deal with food shortages, equipment breakdowns, and men who might not have the best manners after months on the trail." "I understand, Mr. Henderson," Margaret had replied calmly. "I've worked in difficult conditions before. I know how to manage large groups and stretch supplies when necessary." Bull had studied her face, reading the steel beneath her quiet manner. "The men are good boys, mostly, but they've been alone with cattle for months. Some might get ideas about a woman traveling with the outfit. How do you plan to handle that?" Margaret had glanced at Jack, who nodded encouragingly. "I plan to be professional, competent, and clear about boundaries. And I understand that Mr. Cooper has made it known that any inappropriate behavior will be dealt with severely." Bull had chuckled at that. "Jack's got a reputation that tends to keep troublemakers in line, but ultimately you'll earn the men's respect through your cooking and your conduct, not through anyone else's protection." Now, watching the cowboys prepare for departure, Margaret understood what Bull had meant. These weren't the refined gentlemen of proper society, but they weren't the cruel exploiters she'd encountered either. They were working men who judged others by their contribution to the group's success and survival. The cook's role on a cattle drive was crucial, second only to the trail boss in terms of importance to the operation. A good cook could keep morale high during difficult times, while a bad one could cause mutiny. The cowboys might grumble about many things, but they respected anyone who could produce hot, filling meals under challenging conditions. Margaret's first test came at dawn on departure day, when she had to prepare breakfast for 30 hungry men while managing the complexities of her mobile kitchen. She'd risen at 4 in the morning, started the coffee, mixed biscuit dough, and began frying salt pork while the camp slowly came to life around her. The cowboys approached the chuck wagon with curious eyes and cautious optimism. Most trail cooks were older men, grizzled veterans who knew how to stretch beans and make palatable meals from limited ingredients. A young woman in the role was an unknown quantity. "Morning, ma'am," said Tommy Rodriguez, a young cowboy from Texas who couldn't have been more than 20. "That coffee smells mighty fine." "Good morning, Tommy," Margaret replied, ladling coffee into his tin cup. "Biscuits will be ready in a few minutes." She'd made it a point to learn all the cowboys' names during the preparation weeks, understanding that personal recognition was part of building the relationships that would make the trail drive successful. Each man was treated with courtesy and respect, regardless of his position in the outfit's hierarchy. As the men gathered around the chuck wagon for breakfast, Margaret moved efficiently between tasks, turning biscuits in the Dutch oven, checking the progress of the salt pork, refilling coffee cups, and ensuring everyone was properly fed before the day's work began. "Best biscuits I've had since leaving home," declared Charlie Walsh, an older cowboy with graying whiskers, light as clouds and twice as satisfying. Similar compliments followed as the men finished their breakfast and prepared to begin the day's drive. Margaret felt a warm satisfaction at their approval, not because she needed male validation, but because their acceptance meant she was succeeding at a job she'd chosen based on her own abilities. Jack approached the chuck wagon as she was cleaning. Up from breakfast, his expression showing quiet pride in her accomplishment. "How does it feel?" he asked, helping her secure pots and pans for the day's travel. "Different," Margaret admitted, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good different. For the first time since I left Chicago, I feel like I belong somewhere." The cattle drive began in earnest as the sun climbed higher, 2,000 longhorns stretching out in a long line across the Colorado plains. The chuck wagon traveled parallel to the herd, close enough to reach the noon camp quickly, but far enough away to avoid the dust clouds kicked up by thousands of hooves. Margaret had studied trail cooking techniques during her recovery weeks, learning how to prepare meals that could be cooked quickly over open fires and would provide the nutrition needed for hard physical labor. Beans figured heavily in most meals, along with biscuits, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and whatever. Meat was available from hunting or the occasional beef from the herd. But she also brought innovations learned from her boarding house experience, ways to vary the menu using wild herbs and vegetables found along the trail, techniques for making desserts from basic ingredients, and methods for keeping food safe and palatable in challenging conditions. The noon meal was simpler than breakfast: cold biscuits, beans reheated from the previous evening, and coffee. But Margaret had added wild onions found that morning to the beans, improving their flavor and showing her willingness to go beyond the minimum requirements of the job. "You're settling in well," observed Jack during the midday break. "The men are talking about how lucky they are to have a cook who actually cares about the food." "It's honest work," Margaret replied, checking the water barrels and planning the evening meal. "And honest appreciation. I'd forgotten what that felt like." As the afternoon wore on and the herd moved steadily eastward, Margaret found herself experiencing something she'd never expected, a sense of belonging to something larger than herself. The cattle drive was a community with its own rules, relationships, and shared purpose. Everyone had a role to play, and success depended on each person doing their job competently. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret's value wasn't determined by her appearance, her willingness to please others, or her desperation. It was based purely on her ability to contribute meaningfully to the group's welfare. The realization was both liberating and empowering. That evening, as she prepared supper over an open fire while the cattle settled for the night nearby, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a factory worker in Chicago, dreaming of a better life as a mail-order bride. 3 months ago, she'd been sleeping with pigs and slowly starving under Jeremiah Hutchins' cruelty. Now she was Margaret Sullivan, trail cook, earning her own, living through her own skills, respected by her colleagues and confident in her abilities. The transformation seemed almost miraculous, except that she understood now it hadn't been magic that changed her circumstances. It had been the simple recognition that every person deserved to be treated with basic human dignity, and the courage to act on that recognition when others chose indifference. As the stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky, Margaret served supper to 30 hungry cowboys who appreciated her efforts and treated her with the respect she'd earned through competence and professionalism. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. 6 weeks into the cattle drive, Margaret had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. She could break, camp and have the chuck wagon ready to roll in under an hour, prepare meals for 30 men with whatever ingredients were available, and navigate the challenges of trail cooking with competence that impressed even the most seasoned cowboys. But it was on a storm-lashed night in eastern Colorado that Margaret Sullivan truly proved she belonged on the trail. The day had started ominously, with a brass-colored sky and an oppressive stillness that made both cattle and horses nervous. Bull Henderson had been watching the horizon all morning, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied the towering thunderheads building to the west. "We're in for a big one," he told Jack as they rode alongside the herd. "Question is whether we can find shelter before it hits." But the storm moved faster than anticipated, rolling across the plains like a dark avalanche. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain were spattering the dust, and the cattle were becoming increasingly agitated, sensing the electrical tension building in the air. Margaret was preparing the evening meal when the first lightning bolt split the darkening sky, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. The cattle, already nervous, began to mill and bellow, their eyes rolling white with fear. "Storm's coming in hard and fast," Jack called to her, riding up to the chuck wagon at a gallop. "We need to secure everything that can blow away and get ready for a rough night." Margaret had experienced storms before, but never in the middle of open prairie with 2,000 frightened cattle and nowhere to take shelter. She quickly began battening down her mobile kitchen, securing pots and pans, covering supplies with waterproof canvas, and making sure nothing could be lost to the wind. The storm hit with the fury of nature unleashed. Rain came down in sheets, so thick that visibility dropped to mere yards, while lightning split the sky in brilliant, terrifying displays. The thunder was continuous now, a rolling barrage that seemed to come from all directions at once. And then the worst thing that could happen on a cattle drive happened. The herd spooked. It started with a few steers at the edge of the group, their nerves finally snapping under the assault of sound and light. They began to run, and their panic spread like wildfire through the herd. Within minutes, 2,000 longhorns were in full stampede, thundering across the prairie in blind terror. "Stampede!" The cry went up from multiple cowboys at once, barely audible over the storm's roar. "All hands to the herd!" Every available man spurred his horse after the runaway cattle, leaving only Margaret, the horse wrangler, and 2 injured cowboys who couldn't ride in the storm. As she watched the riders disappear into the rain-soaked darkness, Margaret felt a familiar chill of abandonment. But this time, it wasn't personal rejection. It was simply the reality of a crisis that required every able-bodied person to help. Prevent disaster. The wind picked up, howling across the prairie and threatening to overturn the chuck wagon. Margaret struggled to secure the last of her equipment, while the 2 injured cowboys, Pete Morrison with a broken arm and young Billy Santos, nursing a badly twisted ankle, huddled under the wagon's canvas cover. "Miss Sullivan," Pete called. over the storm's noise. "Maybe you should take shelter with us. This wind could knock a person down easy." But Margaret had spotted something that made her stomach drop. In the distance, barely visible through the rain, she could see the glow of a fire that was growing larger despite the downpour. A lightning strike had ignited dry grass, and the wind was whipping the flames into a prairie fire that threatened to spread rapidly across the landscape. "Fire!" she shouted, pointing toward the distant glow. "There's a fire starting!" Pete and Billy struggled to see through the rain, and their faces went pale when they spotted the growing flames. A prairie fire during a storm was a nightmare scenario. It could spread faster than men could ride, consuming everything in its path and trapping both cattle and cowboys in a wall of flame. "We got to warn the others," Billy said, trying to stand, on his injured ankle and immediately wincing in pain. "How?" Pete demanded. "They're miles away chasing spooked cattle, and we can't ride in this storm with our injuries." Margaret stared at the growing fire, her mind racing. The cowboys chasing the stampeding herd had no idea they might be riding into a trap, with fire ahead and storm behind. Someone had to warn them, and someone had to try to stop the fire before it got completely out of control. "I'm going," she announced, moving toward the horses picketed near the chuck wagon. "Ma'am, you can't ride out in this storm," Pete protested. "You're not a cowboy, and that fire's dangerous even for experienced men." "Those men risked everything to help me when I had nothing," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I won't hide under a wagon while they ride into danger." She selected the steadiest horse from the remuda, a reliable gelding named Buck that Jack had been training her to ride during quiet moments on the trail. Margaret wasn't an experienced rider, but 6 weeks of trail life had taught her enough to stay mounted under normal conditions. These, however, were far from normal conditions. The rain had turned the ground treacherous, and Buck struggled for footing as Margaret urged him toward the distant fire. Lightning continued to split the sky, each flash revealing the growing magnitude of the blaze ahead. The fire had already consumed several acres and was spreading rapidly, driven by the wind into an ever-widening semicircle of flame. As Margaret rode closer, she could see that the fire's path would intersect with the likely route of the stampeding cattle. If the herd continued in its current direction, the cowboys chasing them would find themselves trapped between the fire and the storm, with no way to escape. She had to reach them first, had to warn them about the danger ahead. But as she pushed Buck harder through the mud and rain, Margaret realized she faced an impossible choice. She could continue toward the distant cowboys, hoping to warn them in time, or she could try to fight the fire herself and possibly save them all. The decision came to her with startling clarity. Warning the cowboys might save their lives, but if the fire continued to spread, it could consume thousands of acres and threaten settlements downstream. The real solution was to stop. The fire before it grew beyond control. Margaret had learned about fighting prairie fires during her weeks of preparation, listening to stories told around campfires by men who'd faced such emergencies before. The key was creating a firebreak, a strip of burned or cleared ground that the main fire couldn't cross. It was dangerous work that usually required multiple men with proper equipment, but it was the only chance of stopping the blaze. She rode Buck to a position ahead of the fire's path, dismounted, and began the backbreaking work of creating a firebreak with the tools she had available. Using a shovel from the chuck wagon supplies and Buck's blanket, she started setting controlled backfires that would burn toward the main blaze, consuming the fuel in its path and creating a barrier it couldn't cross. The work was terrifying and exhausting. Margaret had to light fires while standing in the path of a larger fire, timing everything perfectly to avoid being trapped by flames moving faster than she could run. The heat was intense. Even through the rain and smoke stung her eyes and burned her lungs, but she persevered, moving methodically along the fire's projected path, setting backfires and using Buck's blanket to beat down flames that threatened to escape. her control. The rain helped, making the grass harder to ignite and slowing the main fire's advance. But it also made her work more difficult as she struggled with wet matches and soggy kindling. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless in the hellish landscape of fire and storm. Margaret's hands were burned, her clothes were singed, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. But gradually, impossibly, her firebreak began to work. The main fire, spreading rapidly across the dry prairie, hit the burned strip Margaret had created and found no fuel to sustain its advance. The flames flickered, weakened, and finally died as they encountered the barrier she'd built with her own hands and determination. As dawn broke through the dissipating storm clouds, Margaret sat beside the exhausted buck, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from the defeated fire. Her face was streaked with ash and tears, her hands were blistered and bleeding, and every muscle in her body ached from the night's exertion. It was there that Jack found her when he returned with the other cowboys, having successfully turned the stampeding herd and brought them back under control. "Margaret!" he called, spurring his horse toward the blackened area where she sat. "Are you hurt? When we saw the fire—" "I'm fine," she said quietly, though her voice was hoarse from smoke. "Inhalation. The fire's out. It won't spread any further." Jack dismounted and knelt beside her, taking in the evidence of her night's work: the carefully planned firebreak, the exhausted horse, the burned tools scattered around the area. His experienced eye immediately recognized what she'd accomplished. "You fought a prairie fire by yourself," he said, his voice filled with something between admiration and disbelief. "In a storm, with no experience and improvised tools." "Someone had to," Margaret replied simply. "You were all chasing the cattle, and the fire would have trapped you if it kept spreading." Bull Henderson and several other cowboys arrived, surveying the scene with growing amazement as they understood what had happened. Margaret Sullivan, the rejected mail-order bride who'd been sleeping with pigs just months before, had single-handedly prevented a disaster that could have killed men and destroyed thousands of acres. "Miss Sullivan," Bull said, his voice carrying the respect reserved for proven heroes, "what you did tonight, that took courage I've rarely seen in 30 years on the trail." Margaret looked up at the circle of men surrounding her, cowboys who'd accepted her as their cook, but now saw her as something more. She'd proven herself not just competent, but indispensable, not just capable, but heroic. "I just did what needed doing," she said, accepting Jack's hand as he helped her to her feet. "Same as any of you would have done." But they all knew it was more than that. Margaret Sullivan had found her strength not in the approval of others, but in the knowledge of her own worth. She'd transformed from a woman seeking rescue to a woman capable of providing it. As the cattle drive resumed later that morning, word of Margaret's heroic night spread through the outfit. She was no longer just the cook, or even just a valued member of the crew. She was someone who'd proven herself when everything was at stake, someone who could be counted on when the chips were down, and most importantly, she was someone who finally knew her own value. 2 years after Margaret Sullivan had been publicly humiliated at the Millfield train station, she returned to Nebraska as a different woman entirely. Gone was the desperate, broken figure who had begged for scraps of human kindness. In her place stood a confident businesswoman who owned 3 successful restaurants along the Colorado-Kansas cattle trail, employed a dozen people, and had built a reputation that stretched from Denver to Chicago. The cattle drive that began her transformation had ended in Kansas City, where Margaret's exceptional trail cooking had attracted the attention of railroad executives looking for someone to manage food service at their new depot restaurant. Her success there led to offers from other towns along the cattle routes, and Margaret had seized each opportunity with the same determination she'd shown fighting the prairie fire. Now she stepped off the train in Millfield, wearing a tailored traveling dress of deep blue wool, her auburn hair elegantly styled, and carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own worth. She'd returned not for revenge or vindication, but to close a circle that had been left incomplete. The town had changed little in her absence. The same buildings lined the main street, the same people conducted their daily business, and the same social hierarchies governed who was accepted and who was cast aside. But Margaret's perspective on the place had changed completely. Where once she'd seen potential salvation, she now saw a small, provincial community trapped by its own prejudices and limitations. Her first stop was Sarah Mitchell's seamstress shop, where the woman who'd shown her the only kindness during her darkest days was surprised to see a familiar face transformed by success and self-assurance. "Margaret," Sarah gasped, looking up from her sewing machine as the elegantly dressed woman entered her shop. "Is that really you?" "Hello, Sarah," Margaret said warmly, embracing the woman who'd risked social disapproval to offer help when no one else would. "You look well. Business seems to be thriving." Sarah stared in amazement at Margaret's transformation. "You look incredible, prosperous. What happened to you after you left? We heard rumors about you working on a cattle drive, but most people assumed I'd died somewhere along the trail." Margaret finished gently. "I understand why. They'd think that. The woman who left Millfield wasn't equipped for survival, but she learned. Over tea and cake that Margaret insisted on buying from the town's finest bakery, she told Sarah about her journey, the cattle drives, the restaurants, the gradual building of a business empire based on her own skills and determination. Sarah listened with growing amazement and pride, seeing vindication for her small act of kindness years before. "I always believed you had strength in you," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "When everyone else saw only a rejected bride, I saw someone who deserved better." "Your kindness saved my life," Margaret replied simply. "When everyone else turned their backs, you offered hope. I've never forgotten that." From Sarah's shop, Margaret made her way through town, observing the changes time had brought. Henderson's general store still bustled with customers, though Mr. Henderson himself looked older and more worn. The hotel where Judge Crawford had dismissed her suffering still hosted the town's elite for their evening meals. The church, where Reverend Hayes had offered only prayers, still stood as a monument to comfortable faith that demanded little real sacrifice. But Margaret's destination lay 5 miles outside town, at the pig farm, where Jeremiah Hutchins had nearly worked her to death for scraps and cruelty. The farm looked even more decrepit than she remembered. The fencing was falling down, the barn was missing half its roof, and weeds grew through the broken boards of the house's front porch. A for sale sign hung crookedly from a rusted post, weathered by seasons of neglect. Margaret found Jeremiah Hutchins behind the main house, looking far older than his years. His stringy hair had gone completely grey, his face was gaunt with poor health, and his clothes hung on a frame that had lost considerable weight. When he saw her approaching, his eyes widened with something between recognition and fear. "You," he whispered, staggering backward. "But you left. You disappeared." "I did leave," Margaret agreed calmly, studying the wreckage of the man who'd once held power over her through her desperation. "I had business to attend to, success to build, a life to create." Jeremiah's gaze took in her expensive clothes, her confident bearing, the unmistakable signs of prosperity and success. "You look different, wealthy." "I am wealthy," Margaret confirmed without false modesty. "I own restaurants, employ good people at fair wages, and treat everyone who works for me with dignity and respect. Amazing what happens when you value human beings as something more than livestock." The barb hit home, and Jeremiah flinched as if struck. "Look, if you're here for revenge—" "I'm not," Margaret interrupted gently. "Revenge would imply that you still have power to hurt me, and you don't. I'm here because I heard your farm was failing, and I wanted to see for myself what becomes of men who build their lives on cruelty." She gestured toward the collapsing buildings, the empty pig pens, the general air of defeat and abandonment. It appears that treating people as less than human eventually destroys the person doing the treating as much as the victim. Jeremiah's shoulders sagged under the weight of his failures. After Margaret's escape with Jack Cooper, word had spread about conditions at the pig farm. No desperate woman would work for him anymore, and without cheap labor, the operation had quickly collapsed. The community that had once ignored his cruelty now whispered behind his back about his failure to maintain even the most basic standards of human decency. "I need money," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "The bank's foreclosing next month. I got nowhere to go, nothing left to sell." Margaret studied him for a long moment. This man who'd taken such pleasure in her suffering, who'd watched her collapse with malnutrition and demanded she work harder. She felt no anger, no desire for revenge, only a kind of sad recognition of how small his world had been, how limited his vision of what human relationships could be. "I'm buying this property," she said at last. Jeremiah's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes. You'd help me? After what I did?" "I'm not helping you," Margaret clarified. "I'm buying the land because it has good water access and could support a way station for travelers. What happens to you after the sale isn't my concern." She pulled a leather portfolio from her travel bag and extracted a bank draft. "This is fair market value for the property, plus enough to cover your debts to the bank. More than fair, actually, considering the condition of the buildings." Jeremiah stared at the bank draft with trembling hands, more money than he'd seen in years. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you pay fair value to someone who treated you worse than an animal?" "Because," Margaret said, "I'm not you. I don't find pleasure in others' suffering, and I don't let other people's failures determine my own behavior. This is business, not charity, and certainly not revenge." As Jeremiah signed the deed with shaking hands, Margaret looked out over the land that would soon belong to her. She could already envision the changes: clean buildings, well-treated employees, travelers finding comfort and fair dealing instead of exploitation and cruelty. "There's one condition to this sale," Margaret added, as Jeremiah pocketed the bank draft. "You tell people exactly why your farm failed. You tell them what happens when you treat human beings as expendable. And you warn them that there are always consequences for cruelty, even if those consequences take time to arrive." Jeremiah nodded mutely, understanding that his reputation in the community was part of the price for his salvation from bankruptcy. That evening, Margaret dined at the Millfield Hotel, the same establishment where town leaders had once dismissed her suffering as the natural consequence of her own moral failings. The dining room buzzed with whispers as word of her return spread, and she was acutely aware of the stares and murmured conversations at neighboring tables. Judge Crawford, considerably older but still imperious, approached her table as she finished her meal. "Miss Sullivan," he said stiffly, "I heard you'd returned to our community, quite successfully from all appearances." "Judge Crawford," Margaret replied politely, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "Yes, I've been fortunate in my business ventures. I trust you harbor no ill will toward Millfield," the judge continued carefully. "Young people sometimes face difficulties that teach valuable lessons about character and perseverance." Margaret smiled, recognizing the judge's attempt to reframe her suffering as some kind of moral education rather than community failure. "I learned a great deal during my time here," she agreed. "Primarily about the importance of treating all people with basic human dignity, regardless of their circumstances." The judge shifted uncomfortably, sensing the implied criticism. "Yes, well, we're all pleased to see you've done well for yourself." "Thank you," Margaret said graciously. "Though I should mention that my success came despite this community's treatment, not because of it. The people who actually helped me were those willing to take risks to defend the powerless. As Judge Crawford retreated to his own table, Margaret reflected on how completely her relationship with power had changed. 2 years ago, she'd begged this man for help and been dismissed. Now, he sought her approval, worried about her opinion of his community's character. The next morning, Margaret prepared to leave Millfield for the final time. But before boarding the train, she made one last stop at the town cemetery, where she placed flowers on the graves of people whose names she'd learned from the church records, other desperate souls who died forgotten and unmourned, victims of the same indifference that had nearly destroyed her. Standing among the weathered headstones, Margaret spoke quietly to those who couldn't hear but deserved to be remembered. You weren't forgotten. Your lives had value, even if nobody told you so. And maybe because of what happened to me, the next person who comes here desperate and alone will find more kindness than we did. As the train carried her back toward Colorado and the business empire she'd built on principles of fair treatment and human dignity, Margaret watched the Nebraska plains scroll past her window. She thought about the journey that had brought her from that broken woman sleeping with pigs to the confident entrepreneur she'd become. The transformation hadn't been magic or luck. It had been the result of one person, Jack Cooper, choosing to see her humanity when everyone else saw only problems to be avoided. His intervention hadn't just saved her life. It had shown her that she possessed strength and value that no one else's opinion could diminish. In her purse, Margaret carried a letter from Jack, who'd settled on a ranch in Montana and married a widow with 2 children. His letter spoke of contentment, of finding peace in an honest life, surrounded by people who valued him for his character rather than his reputation. He'd found his own redemption through choosing to help rather than harm. Margaret's story had begun with rejection and desperation, but it ended with success built on her own terms. She'd learned that true worth couldn't be granted or taken away by others. It had to be claimed and defended by the person who possessed it. As the train whistle sounded across the prairie, carrying her toward a future she'd created through her own courage and determination, Margaret Sullivan smiled. She'd started as a woman seeking salvation from others and become a woman capable of providing it for herself. The rejected mail-order bride had found something better than the marriage she'd originally sought. She'd found herself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,